To the world this week, it's not just New York City, by the way, or Washington, but the entire planet that's been reflecting on 9/11 and its consequences today. Before we begin, let's check a sample of this week's main stories. Consequences where we can see, for instance, that we have the US president and a fractious Congress who are struggling to scrape the means together to create jobs. You've got a NATO-backed coalition trying to stay below the radar to let Libyans own their own revolution. Turkey's premier has been talking tough on Israel, while Iran's president tries to gently caution his Syrian counterpart to pay heed to the protesters in the streets. Now, what link between those events and the hijacked planes that literally came out of the blue on the gloriously sunny morning of September the 11th, 2001? Why did that happen? How have our lives changed? And are we now beyond 9/11? The world this week, or perhaps I should say the world this decade, is in partnership with the International Herald Tribune. Welcome, Eric Fanner. How are you?
Good to be back.
Also with us, Judah Grunstein, who's responsible for all things you see on World Politics Review. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Sitting to his right is Loïc Péroux, France 24 senior editor, who in a previous life was the Washington correspondent for TF1, France's most watched private broadcaster.
And I hope, Francois, that your viewers will excuse my English.
No doubt. And from New York City, Newsweek's Christopher Dickey, author of Securing the City, a book that tells you just how the New York Police Department goes about. A fascinating book. Thanks for being with us, Chris. You're in New York there for September the 11th. Thanks for being with us. The World This Week, which, by the way, you can follow on Facebook and on Twitter, our handle here at Francois F24. Eric, I'm going to begin with the front covers of the International Herald Tribune of Wednesday, the September the 12th, and Thursday, September the 13th. Perhaps we can call them up. There you see the 12th. Obviously going beyond the black and white layouts, which of a decade ago. What goes through your mind when you see those covers there?
Well, it's interesting seeing it in black and white, actually, because one of the things that struck me this time around 10 years later is it's the first anniversary where we can kind of look at 9/11 with a sense of perspective of history, in a way.
Because of the fact that Osama bin Laden's been killed?
That and the Arab Spring, and obviously 10 years is a nice round year. I think, some of the, obviously it's still a hugely emotional event, and as we're seeing with the coverage of recent days, but we can look at it in a bit more analytical way, I think, as a result, and look at what maybe not the causes, but certainly the consequences and some of the things that we're still trying to figure out from it in a bit more of with a bit of sense of history.
When you dip into the archives, what do you see about the world the way it was 10 years ago?
Well, it was different. It was a different world. There was one superpower that was was unassailable, or we thought, both its economy and militarily, politically. There was one country that was clearly much stronger than the rest of the world, and now we live in a very different world where neither the United States or Al Qaeda have won. I mean, they're certainly two of the losers of 9/11. We've got a rising power in China. That was on the horizon 10 years ago, but it's very different now. So those are certainly powerful trends that were only just emerging then.
Comparing then to now, Christopher Dickey, describe for us your September the 11th, 2001.
You mean what happened to me then, or what's
Exactly.
happened to the world since?
What happened then?
Well, I was in New York at the time as it happened, just as I am now, and I had closed myself up in a little apartment on the Upper East Side and thought that I wouldn't even turn on the television, but fortunately the superintendent of the building knocked on the door and said, "You're a journalist, aren't you? An airplane has just crashed into the World Trade Center." And I turned on the TV and saw the second plane crash into the Trade Center. And I'd been covering Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda for about 9 years before that, so I didn't have any doubt about what had happened. And I walked across Central Park to where our offices were then, and got to work on the story that I've been covering ever since.
When you see the planes hit, at that point, what did you imagine would happen next?
Well, I don't think even Osama bin Laden imagined that the two towers would come down and that the casualty toll would be as astronomical as it was. In fact, we know that al-Qaeda had thought that they would mount a second wave of attacks, and they were completely unprepared to deal with the level of security that was imposed, a shutdown of all aviation in America for days on end, that sort of thing. What Osama hoped would happen is that the Americans would overreact, that they would start wars in the Arab world, that they would occupy Arab countries, and that they would create a level of hatred and resentment in the Arab world that was equal to that of the small group of ideologues in al-Qaeda. And Osama guessed right on that one. That's pretty much what the Bush administration did.
We'll talk in a moment about the two wars you're alluding to in Afghanistan and Iraq. First, let me read to you from the France 24 World This Week Facebook page what a good friend of mine, John from New Jersey, who commutes every day into Manhattan for work, wrote. He said, on a train heading for New York, someone looked out the window and pointed at what appeared to be a fire on the upper floors. By the time we arrived in Penn Station, 10 minutes later, the full impact started to sink in. People were scared, crying, shocked. Then, with the dust cloud settling over New York, the scene turned grim and macabre. People covered in dust were walking away from the scene. Everyone was resolute, purposeful, trying to get home. Only when I finally got home did I cry, and then didn't stop for a month. Judah Grunstein, you're born in Brooklyn. This is something that, again, nobody imagined.
Well, I know for me, the World Trade Center was part of the New York skyline for my entire life. In fact, the first time I flew into New York after 9/11, it took me a minute to locate Manhattan Island because that had been the landmark for me. I had my own experience was quite different from Christopher's and from John's in the sense that I was in the south of France in a tiny village. Very isolated. I was telling Loic and Eric before the show. So at the same time that I had an emotional reaction to watching, especially the second tower go down live, as a New Yorker, I was so far away and in such a really sheltered environment that I didn't feel that sense of panic. There was a real sense of confusion and uncertainty, and I think that and fear. Not for myself personally, but for what was happening and for what it meant. And I think that that question of the way in which things conspired to create unimaginable outcomes really did escalate the reaction. The idea that the towers could come down, I mean, had you told me beforehand that someone would try to do it, I would have said it was impossible to succeed. In fact, they'd already tried almost 10 years before. I'd been to the top of those buildings. They seemed indestructible and permanent. And when something that is that permanent and that physical, a landmark in your life goes down, it really leads you to start wondering what else is not as permanent as you had imagined or assumed. And I think that reaction carried out throughout the country really contributed to the way in which America reacted afterwards.
All right, and Loic Berrou, it wasn't just obviously New York, because there was a plane that went down in western Pennsylvania, plane that goes down in the Pentagon. You're the Washington correspondent, but you were telling me, of course, the first thing they do is they try to send you to New York.
Yeah, of course, because we happened to have the two of us were based out of Washington, D.C., and we didn't have an office in New York at that time, and I was just casually watching my TV, gearing up to go downtown to join my office, and when I think Chris is pretty lucky that he realized straight at the minute that it was Al-Qaeda and Bin Laden's work, because the first 15 to 20 minutes, the first half hour was just sheer disbelief and doubts and tourism plane, a DC-3 mentioned on NPR, and it took us some time to realize what that really happened. I think not until the towers fell that we could realize. And
So you took a 10 a.m. train? Is
that
that
was the last train that lay
10 a.m. in the morning.
10 a.m. So when driving, I heard actually the plane landing on the Pentagon, which was a pretty loud.
So you were pretty fast off the mark. That's an hour and 15 minutes later.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was full of people heading back for New York, most of them having their family in New York, all of them on the phone with their relatives, some of them in the towers. And the train stopped in Baltimore, and people just left, and they were idle, sitting on the train tracks, literally sitting on their suitcases and looking, either listening to radio calling or looking with sort of a void look in their eyes. That was amazing, and a silence that was also very amazing, and it headed me to the five most amazing weeks of report of my life.
And Eric Fenner, you too were grounded. You were in Chicago.
That's right. I was living in Europe at the time, actually, but happened to be on vacation in Chicago, and so I had a sort of surreal experience, a bit like Judah's maybe, where I was visiting my sister and sort of jet-lagged morning, and the first thing I remember was looking out the window that morning and seeing a man drive a pickup truck. I heard it screech to a halt, and he came running out of his truck and went up to the door of the house next door and just scooped up his family, his kids and his wife, in his arms. And I thought, there's obviously nothing wrong with them, but it was just, I hadn't seen what had happened yet, so I turned on the television. But even before I did, I knew that something dramatic had happened, because this was a quiet neighborhood in Chicago. There was obviously nothing wrong there, so something clearly, overwhelming must have happened. And I turned on the television then and watched it. Yeah.
Which brings us to why September 11th happened. On Wednesday, we held a Google Plus Hangout with some of the viewers, and some very moving personal stories as well there, from all over the world. And this startling remark from Regis, who lives in Orlando, Florida, but grew up in part in Ethiopia. He says he was shocked, but not completely surprised when 9/11 happened.
I was already aware of the existence of Bin Laden, and I was already aware of the discontent among many countries about the way the West was, having the foreign policy across the globe. And I always felt like it was just a matter of time before someone attempts to retaliate.
When he talks about how he has that premonition, Christopher Dickey, earlier you were saying you look at the towers, you know right away it's Bin Laden. Did you have that kind of premonition that something would happen like this?
Actually, I did. I wrote a whole novel about it in 1994, 95 that was published in 97 called Innocent Blood, about bringing radical Islamic terror back to the United States. That was based on what was done with the first attempt to blow up the World Trade Center in 1993. And in fact, very much like the person who was just talking, I was listening to lots of people all over the world who had a very similar message, which was America's like something in the middle of a hurricane. Americans look up and all they see is blue skies, while all around them there's death and destruction. And it's not until Americans feel that death and destruction that there's going to be any kind of peace in the world. And that's the essential Bin Laden message, and that's what a lot of people responded to when they actually said some positive things about the atrocities carried out on 9/11. But what had happened over the previous decade is that Americans had become completely oblivious to what was happening, to the rise of Al-Qaeda, to the rise of these terrorist movements, to lots of things that were happening in developing countries in the Muslim world, and not only in the Muslim world. And I think that was one reason that the reaction in the United States was so completely stunned. Newsweek ran a cover story, I didn't write it, somebody else wrote it, that said, why do they hate us? And in an eternal memo I sent to the editors, I said, the real question in the rest of the world is, why do they all think we hate them? So these were the kinds of issues that were at play at the time. And so I wasn't surprised at 9/11. Appalled, horrified, disgusted, yes, but I wasn't surprised.
We are pleased, Christopher, to be joined now by Nushabeh Amiri, the editor of Ruse Online, the preeminent source for Iranian news in Farsi and also a little bit in English.
In English.
As well. Thanks for joining us. One of the other points that was made by Regis, actually, and this picks up on what Christopher was saying just now, is that at university in Florida, he says that the political science classes that he took, the Americans would sit in the back until after 9/11, where now they suddenly like to sit in the front. Do you also have that sense that the United States, after this, sort of discovered the rest of the world to a certain degree?
Well, I really don't know because all the information that we have is so contradictional. Everybody says something and the other. I was in the taxi driver. He gave me an analysis, a real analysis of what is going on, and gave me all sort of information which didn't match together. In fact, I think we don't have that much information. What I see from the far is, in fact, more fear. And a sort of distance between the American, and becoming more American than before, and having a sort of distance with the people of the other country, without in fact knowing the exact and the sources of this hate and how it happened, why it happened. I guess nobody knows. Even now, nobody knows the situation. Yeah, I see a sort of situation which is not cleared yet.
Just very briefly before we go to the break, Judah, have Americans caught up when it comes to discovering the rest of the world?
Well, I don't know if that's how I'd put it. I think that Christopher was right when he put it in the context of the end of the 90s. I mean, the 90s was the internet decade. It was this sort of go-go, feel-good, everyone pretty much in the United States having a big party for 10 years.
War and, yeah.
And so I think that the world and America maybe met each other in pain, in the sense that it's true that Americans have lived very privileged lives compared to most of the countries around the world.
This was the end to that.
And over the past 10 years, I think there's been a lot of, I think over the last couple of years too, I mean, Americans are hurting now and suffering economically, and I think that there has been a leveling of sorts.
We're going to pick up on that point when we come back. Stay with us. You're watching a special edition of The World This Week.